You may think that Fort Sumter is just another fort that had some tiny battle where nobody died and nothing happened. If so, you're partly right. Nobody died in it, and it wasn't that big of a battle. But it started the bloodiest war in U.S. history, the Civil War. Fort Sumter was based in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Originally, Major Anderson was in Fort Moultrie, but I'll tell you more about that later. The man in charge of Fort Sumter was Major Robert Anderson, who actually owned his own slaves and was born in the South, but was loyal to the Union. The fort was surrounded by Confederates because South Carolina had just formed the Confederate States of America. The person in charge of Charleston Harbor at the time was General P.G.T. Beauregard, who was being pressured to attack Fort Sumter. But before I can tell you that story, I have to tell you this story. Before the Civil War, as you probably know, slavery was really bad. The South was a pro-slave area, and the North was a slave-free area. Slaves had a pretty miserable life. They only got, per year, 2 linen shirts, 1 pair of linen pants, 1 jacket, 1 pair of stockings, 1 pair of shoes, and 1 pair of trousers for the winter. The slaves' quarters were tiny, with dirt floors, and rarely had any furniture. The slaves also got almost no food and were never paid anything. The worst part of it is that slaves got beat up and whipped for sometimes absolutely no reason. So their lives were pretty miserable. Then, on November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th president. It was a weird election because Abe only got 40% of the vote against the other 3 candidates. Anyway, right after the election, South Carolina left the U.S. and formed the Confederate States of America. So, Fort Moultrie, Fort Sumter, and Castle Pickens were 3 Union forts in Confederate territory. Castle Pickens was abandoned, and Fort Sumter was unfinished with no one in it. But Fort Moultrie was the fort that Major Anderson and his men were in. South Carolina had wanted Major Anderson out of their territory. Later, on December 26, as things were getting more intense between Major Anderson and South Carolina, Major Anderson moved his men from Fort Moultrie to Fort Sumter because it was more defensible there. This move really ticked the Confederates off. Okay, back to Fort Sumter. On January 9, 1861, South Carolina troops shot at the Star of the West and forced them to turn back. This was the ship that the Union had sent for Major Anderson with all the supplies that he needed. Then, on April 11, 1861, General P.G.T. Beauregard sent 2 aides over on a boat to demand surrender of Fort Sumter. The Confederates had already taken control of Fort Moultrie and Castle Pickens and had cannons pointing towards Fort Sumter from all directions. Anderson said if supplies did not reach him by April 15th, he would surrender, but that wasn't good enough for the Confederates. Anderson refused to surrender even with the threats of attacking Fort Sumter. At 4:30 a.m. the next day, the Confederates attacked. The Union was really low on supplies, so they didn't even shoot back for 2 hours. And during the battle, they shot with tons of accuracy to conserve ammo. They also lacked fuses for exploding cannon shells, so they had to hit the Confederates directly. Also, while the Confederates had hundreds of people fighting Major Anderson only had 85 men. All the odds were against them. During the night, things calmed down a little bit, but the Confederates still shot off a cannon once in a while. A few times during the night, a red-hot cannon would go off and set the wooden barracks on fire. The Union was able to put the fire out with some help from midnight rain. The battle continued until the next day and lasted in all for 35 hours. Then, the barracks set on fire again, and they were not able to put out the fire. Anderson lifted the white flag of surrender, and the battle was finally over. Before they left for New York, Major Anderson performed their 100-gun salute. The performance was cut short because on the 50th shot, there was an accidental explosion which killed 1 person and mortally injured another. Anyway, when Major Anderson and all his men returned to New York, they were treated as heroes. Amazingly, no one died in the battle, except for that one guy during the 100-gun salute. But it's ironic because this one battle started the bloodiest battle in U.S. history. Right after the Battle of Fort Sumter, this newspaper came out with a story about it. This is really cool because they actually have the telegraphed conversation between P.G.T. Beauregard and L.P. Walker, the Secretary of War. The conversation went a little like this. An authorized messenger from President Lincoln just informed Governor Pickens and myself that provisions will be sent to Fort Sumter, peaceably or otherwise by force. Signed, PGT Beauregard.
If you have no doubt of the authorized character of agent who communicated to you the intentions of the Washington government to supply Fort Sumter by force, you will at once demand its evacuation, and if this is refused, proceed to much manner as you determine to reduce it. Signed, L.P. Walker, Secretary of War. The demand will be made tomorrow at 12 o'clock. Signed, PGT Beauregard. Then it goes on and talks about what happened in the battle, which I've already told you about. Right after Major Anderson left, the Confederates took over Fort Sumter and used it during the remainder of the Civil War. They also warded off some attacks from the Union trying to reclaim the fort. So, this is the battle that started the Civil War. War was kind of hesitant at first, but after a while, both sides knew that the war would go on for quite a while. 620,000 people died in the Civil War. Because of the Battle of Fort Sumter, the government tries to enforce law, but also keep the Union together. For example, during the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt passed laws that allowed poor people to find work and make more income. The laws also helped end the Great Depression economically and helped get things back to normal. If the Depression had gone on, people might have started rioting and started a rebellion. In this section of Franklin Roosevelt's speech, he was giving thanks to the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, for helping create more jobs and getting more income to workers and overall ending the Great Depression. The CCC also offered food and shelter to people who needed it. Another example is in the Civil Rights Movement, when President Kennedy sent federal troops to the University of Mississippi so that rioters would not prevent James Meredith, the school's first black student, from going to school there. This is something the federal government did to protect the rights of others. This is James Meredith actually walking into the University of Mississippi. As you can see, there are a lot of people around him, like this guy, and this guy, and this guy, and this guy, and all these people back here. These are all people from the U.S. Marshal sent by JFK so the riots wouldn't hurt James from getting into the building. When James Meredith got in and was put into classes, all the other white kids left in protest that he had to be there, so he was the only one in class. In 2000, during the Al Gore and George Bush election, the results were essentially a tie. In other countries, there might have been riots and protests and even civil war. But because of our government systems with the Supreme Court and Electoral College, we were able to not have violence, even though we disagreed with each other. Think of it this way. Pretend the guy that I'm drawing right now is trying to split the U.S. apart and get everybody mad at each other and get everybody to start fighting. We need a force to stop this guy. Our government is kind of like that force. It has laws and systems that make sure everybody's rights are protected, but also make sure that nothing like the Civil War ever happens again. It's been 150 years since the Civil War started, and not once have we come close to splitting apart again. I think our government has learned a huge lesson from the Battle of Fort Sumter, and the Civil War, and its aftermath that followed. We understand that there needs to be a balance between enforcing human rights and also preserving the Union.